At 70 years old, Emily believed that 42 years of marriage had bought her a sanctuary against the storms of life. After 4 decades of building a legacy, a home, and a family that she thought was her bedrock, she expected her sunset years to be a gentle fading of the light. But as the doctor delivered the diagnosis that her memories were beginning to slip away, the coldness that followed from her husband, Barrett, was more paralyzing than the illness itself. Emily wasn't just sick, she was being discarded, liquidated. It was as if 42 years of devotion could be shredded like scrap paper with a single divorce filing. The family estate to the husband, the savings to the children, the life's work to the heirs who hadn't earned a penny of it. While Barrett walked out of the hospital room without a backward glance, already calculating the freedom her absence would bring, Emily was left with what he called the leftovers, a tattered diary she couldn't remember writing and a deed to a derelict lakeside cabin in a town that had vanished from her mind. The nurses couldn't even hide their sorrow when they helped her pack her single suitcase. Emily left the life she knew with nothing but a questioning gesture and the profound humiliation of being treated like a ghost by the man who had promised to be her memory. But what Barrett and her greedy children didn't know, what they were too cold and impatient to understand, is that when you strip a woman of everything she has, you accidentally give her the one thing she needs to destroy you, the truth. The room smelled of antiseptic and forgotten dreams. Emily sat propped up against the thin pillows, her silvery gray hair unkempt and her light blue hospital gown slipping slightly at the shoulder. Her hands, once steady enough to paint the landscapes that hung in their foyer, now trembled with a tentative, questioning gesture. She reached out toward Barrett, her eyes watery and rimmed with a deep, aching redness. She was looking for a hand to hold, a familiar touch to anchor her as the names of her own children flickered like dying candles in her mind. Barrett, however, did not reach back. Standing at the foot of the bed in his dark navy jacket, he looked less like a husband of 4 decades and more like a liquidator presiding over a bankrupt firm. His expression was a portrait of resolute detachment, his salt and pepper beard trimmed to a precision that felt sharp enough to cut. He wasn't looking at the woman he had toasted at their silver anniversary, he was looking at a problem that had finally become too expensive to maintain. "I've spent the morning with the lawyers, Emily," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth that usually accompanied his updates on their life. "The doctors say the decline is accelerating. They say the woman I married is, well, she's retreating." Emily tilted her head, a look of profound confusion washing over her features. "Barrett? Where are the lilies? You always bring lilies on Tuesdays." He didn't flinch at the mention of their decades-long tradition. Instead, he tightened his grip on a sheaf of official-looking papers clutched in his left hand. "There won't be any lilies today. There's no point in decorating a room you won't remember being in tomorrow." With a movement that was mid-stride and practiced, Barrett turned toward the door, pivoting away from her reaching hand. He didn't offer a kiss on the forehead or a promise to return after dinner. He simply placed the thin folder on the rolling meal tray, sliding it toward her like a bill at a restaurant. "These are the dissolution papers," he stated, his gaze fixed on the exit. "I've made arrangements. The mansion, the accounts, the investments, they require a steady hand to manage, Emily. A hand that doesn't shake. I can't be shackled to a ghost, and the children agree. We have to protect the legacy before it's all consumed by the cost of your vanishing." Emily wasn't just sick, she was being liquidated. It was as if 42 years of devotion could be shredded like scrap paper with a single filing. The family estate to the husband, the savings to the children, the life's work to the heirs who hadn't earned a penny of it. While Barrett walked out of the hospital room without a backward glance, already calculating the freedom her absence would bring, Emily was left with what he called the leftovers. Underneath the legal documents lay a small, tattered diary she didn't recognize and a single, rusted key taped to a deed for a derelict lakeside cabin in a town that had vanished from her map of reality. The paper cut she received as she reached for the folder was the only thing that felt sharp and real in a world turning to smoke. The nurses at the station watched through the glass, their eyes filled with a sorrow they couldn't voice. They had seen many things in this wing, but the clinical precision of Barrett's departure was a new kind of cruelty. Emily left the life she knew that afternoon with nothing but a questioning gesture and the profound humiliation of being treated like a ghost by the man who had promised to be her memory. As Barrett's expensive leather shoes clicked down the hallway, the sound fading into the distance, Emily clutched the tattered diary to her chest. Her mind was a fog, yes, but deep within the mist, a single spark of her old self remained, waiting for the medication to wear off and the reckoning to begin. To understand the depth of the betrayal, one had to look back at the foundation of the 42-year monument Barrett was now systematically dismantling. Their life had been a masterclass in suburban perfection, a curated gallery of high-achieving children, charitable galas, and a marriage that friends often cited as their North Star. In the early years, Emily had been the silent architect of Barrett's success, balancing the ledgers of his burgeoning firm while raising Rachel and Curtis with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. She was the one who remembered the birthdays of every client's spouse, the one who turned a drafty house into a warm estate, and the one who had inherited the seed money from her own father that had jump-started Barrett's empire. For decades, the rhythm of their lives was as steady as a heartbeat. There were the summers in the Hamptons where the children learned to sail, and the winters where the house smelled of cinnamon and expensive pine. Emily had been the vibrant center of it all, a woman whose mind was a steel trap for details, dates, and the subtle nuances of her husband's moods. She knew the exact moment Barrett needed a scotch or a silent room, and she provided both with a grace that asked for nothing in return. They were the couple that still held hands at the theater, the pair that seemed immune to the erosion of time. But 3 years ago, the blur began to creep in like a slow-moving fog over a calm lake. It started with small, almost invisible fractures in her perfect recall. A missed dentist appointment here, a misplaced set of car keys there. At first, they laughed it off as senior moments, a natural tax on a life lived at full speed. Barrett would wrap an arm around her, kissing her temple and whispering that he would remember for both of them. It was a comforting promise, a vow of protection that Emily leaned into with every ounce of her being. As the months passed, however, the fog thickened and turned strange. The confusion wasn't just a loss of memory, it was a heavy, physical lethargy that seemed to settle behind her eyes every morning. She began to find herself standing in the middle of her sprawling kitchen, holding a tea kettle she didn't remember filling, staring at a calendar that seemed written in a language she no longer understood. Barrett became her primary caregiver, the one who meticulously organized her daily vitamins and specialized memory boosters that the private doctor, a close associate of Barrett's, had prescribed. The vibrant, sharp-edged Emily began to soften into a ghost of herself. She stopped painting because the brushes felt too heavy. She stopped hosting because the names of her oldest friends became slippery, sliding away just as she reached for them. Rachel and Curtis, once so close, began to treat her with a polite, distant pity, speaking about her in the third person while she sat right in front of them. Mom's having a bad day, they would sigh, exchanging meaningful looks with their father. Barrett was always there, a pillar of strength, guiding her hand as she signed routine, financial documents she was too tired to read. He would tell her the business was struggling and that they needed to consolidate her inheritance into his accounts for safety. And Emily, trusting the man who had been her anchor for 4 decades, gave him everything, her signatures, her assets, and finally, her autonomy. She didn't realize that as she was fading, he was glowing, growing more resolute and detached with every piece of her that he claimed as his own. The 42-year blur wasn't an act of nature, it was a slow-motion heist of a woman's entire existence. The day after Barrett's clinical departure, the heavy oak door of the hospital room swung open once more, but there was no comfort in the sound. Rachel and Curtis entered not with the hushed reverence of grieving children, but with the sharp, kinetic energy of auditors arriving at a liquidation sale. Rachel, draped in a coat that cost more than Emily's first car, didn't head for the bed to offer a hug. Instead, she went straight to the small bedside locker, her eyes scanning the surface with a predatory flicker. Curtis followed, checking his watch with an impatient sigh that made it clear his mother's tragedy was merely an inconvenient line item on his afternoon schedule. "Mom, you look like you're resting," Rachel said, her voice a thin veneer of concern that didn't reach her eyes. She began to pick up the few personal items Emily had been allowed to keep, a small porcelain clock, a gold-rimmed compact. "We were just talking to Dad about the logistics. Since you'll be moving to that specialized place soon, we thought it would be best if we took the valuables for safekeeping. You know how these facilities can be. Things just vanish." Emily watched them through a haze, her fingers twisting the hem of her light blue gown. In her mind, Rachel was still the little girl who cried over a scraped knee, and Curtis was the boy who promised to protect her from the dark. But the people standing before her were strangers, carved from the same cold stone as their father. "The sapphire set, Mom," Curtis interrupted, his voice echoing the same pragmatism Barrett had used the day before. "The one from Grandma. Dad said you used to keep the safety deposit keys in the velvet lining of your jewelry box, but the box is empty. Do you remember where you moved them? It's important we get them into the estate vault before the paperwork is finalized." Emily blinked, her watery eyes searching their faces for a single shred of genuine affection. "The sapphires? I think they're in the study. Or maybe the bank." Rachel's jaw tightened. She didn't offer a reassuring word or a hand to steady Emily's trembling. Instead, she leaned in closer, her perfume cloying and aggressive in the sterile air. "Think, Mom. The bank manager said you came in alone 3 months ago. You withdrew something. Was it the keys? The deed to the family trust properties? We need to know where you put them before it goes completely." It was a scene of calculated cruelty. While Emily struggled to remember the sequence of her own life, her children were busy stripping the carcass of her existence. They moved through her belongings like vultures, opening her purse, rifling through the pockets of her discarded sweater, and whispering to each other in clipped, urgent tones about missing assets and legal loopholes. They spoke about her as if she were already an inanimate object, a chest of drawers to be emptied before being hauled away to the curb. When they finally realized that her fog was too thick to offer the answers they craved, the mask of civility dropped entirely. Curtis let out a jagged breath of frustration, and Rachel threw the gold compact back onto the tray with a metallic clatter that made Emily flinch. They didn't stay to share a meal or tell her they loved her. They left with a hurried promise to check the house again, their footsteps echoing down the hall with the same cold, rhythmic click that Barrett's had the day before. Left alone in the deepening shadows of the room, Emily clutched the tattered diary to her chest, the only thing they hadn't bothered to steal because they saw no value in a book of old words. They didn't realize that while they were looking for gold and keys, they had overlooked the only weapon that truly mattered. The transition from the sterile, white-walled sanctuary of the hospital to the world outside was not the homecoming Emily had spent 42 years imagining. There was no welcoming committee, no celebratory dinner, and no arm around her shoulder to guide her up the front steps of the manor she had called home. Instead, there was only the hum of a hired black sedan and the heavy, oppressive silence of Barrett sitting in the front seat, refusing to meet her eyes in the rearview mirror. He treated the drive like a chore, a final errand to be checked off a list before his new life could truly begin. When the smooth pavement of the highway gave way to the jarring rhythm of a gravel road, Emily felt a phantom twitch of recognition in her fingertips, though her mind couldn't place the location. They were deep in the woods now, where the trees grew tall and spindly, their branches interlacing like skeletal fingers to block out the afternoon sun. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and rotting cedar, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic scent that had defined her existence for weeks. The sedan eventually came to a halt in front of a structure that looked less like a home and more like a memory left out in the rain to warp. The forgotten cabin sat on the edge of a slate-gray lake, its timber walls darkened by decades of moisture and its porch sagging under the weight of overgrown ivy. It was a derelict relic of a life Emily didn't remember owning, a piece of land her father had supposedly bought on a whim half a century ago. To Barrett and the children, it was a convenient dumping ground, a place far enough away from their social circles that Emily's condition wouldn't be an embarrassment, and isolated enough that she would remain out of the way. Barrett climbed out of the car, his movements efficient and cold. He didn't offer his hand to help her navigate the uneven ground. Instead, he reached into the trunk and pulled out a single, battered suitcase, the sum total of her 42 years of marriage, and set it on the moss-covered porch. Beside it, he placed a small, plastic medical organizer filled with the pale blue pills that were supposed to be her lifeline. "The nurse will be by twice a week to check on you, Emily," Barrett said, his voice clipped and businesslike, barely audible over the wind whistling through the pines. "I've stocked the pantry with the basics. It's better this way. The city was too loud for you, too confusing. Here, you can have your peace." Emily stood on the grass, her light blue hospital gown fluttering beneath the heavy wool coat they had draped over her shoulders. She looked at the cabin, then at the man she had loved with every fiber of her being, and for a moment, the fog in her mind parted just enough to reveal a jagged edge of terror. "Barrett? You aren't staying? It's very dark here." He didn't answer. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out the rusted key she had seen in the hospital, and pressed it into her palm. His touch was as fleeting as a shadow. "Take your medication, Emily. Don't skip the evening dose. It keeps the agitation away." With that, he turned and stepped back into the car. The engine turned over with a growl that felt like a final goodbye. Emily watched as the sedan reversed down the narrow track, the red glow of its taillights disappearing into the greenery like two receding eyes. She was alone. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the lapping of the dark water against the shore and the rustle of the wind. She turned toward the cabin, her fingers trembling as she fit the key into the stiff, salt-corroded lock. The door groaned open to reveal a single room layered in dust and the scent of old paper. On the kitchen table sat the plastic medical organizer, its lids labeled for each day of the week, a countdown of her remaining lucidity. She reached for the Monday slot, the small blue pill looking harmless in the palm of her hand. She had been told these were her memory boosters, the only thing standing between her and total darkness. But as she looked out at the lake, a strange, instinctual chill ran down her spine. For the first time in years, Barrett wasn't there to watch her swallow it. For the first time, she was the keeper of her own body, and as she clutched the tattered diary to her chest, she felt a flicker of a thought that didn't belong to the fog. What if the darkness wasn't coming from her mind, but from the medicine meant to save it? The first night in the cabin was a symphony of isolation. The structure groaned under the weight of the coastal wind, and the dark water of the lake slapped rhythmically against the rotted pilings of the small dock, sounding like a steady, accusing heartbeat. Emily had fallen into a heavy, drug-induced stupor shortly after arriving, collapsing onto the dusty bed with her wool coat still draped over her shoulders. When she finally stirred, the sun was already high, casting long, slanted beams of light through the grime-streaked windows, illuminating the millions of dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. She reached instinctively for the plastic medical organizer on the bedside crate, her fingers brushing against the Tuesday slot. But as she went to flip the lid, her hand faltered. The small, tattered diary, the one thing Barrett hadn't deemed worth stealing, had fallen to the floor during her fitful sleep. It lay open to a page dated exactly 1 year ago. The handwriting was hers, but it was frantic, the letters jagged and pressed so hard into the paper they had nearly torn through. "The fog isn't a cloud," the entry read. "It's a curtain. He's drawing it every morning at breakfast." Emily stared at the words, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. The confusion that usually greeted her in the morning, that thick, syrupy layer of mental cotton, felt different today. Because she had arrived so late and collapsed so abruptly, she had missed the previous night's evening dose. For the first time in 3 years, 16 hours had passed without a pale blue pill entering her bloodstream. She sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the familiar dizziness to claim her, but it didn't come. Instead, a terrifyingly sharp sensation began to pulse at the base of her skull. It was like a shutter opening on a long-forgotten camera. The blurred edges of the room began to snap into focus. She noticed the specific pattern of the water stains on the ceiling. She recognized the smell of the air, not just old, but specifically pine resin and the metallic tang of lake silt. She stood up, her legs feeling strangely light. She walked to the small cracked mirror above the sink and gasped. The woman staring back was a stranger, her skin sallow and her eyes clouded with a sedative haze that was only just beginning to evaporate. As the minutes ticked by, the blur of the last 42 years didn't just fade, it reorganized itself. Memories that had been slippery as fish suddenly became solid. She remembered the day she inherited her father's estate, the massive sum of money that had quietly funded Barrett's first 3 acquisitions. She remembered the look on Barrett's face 6 months ago when she had questioned the taste of the vitamins he was crushing into her oatmeal. It hadn't been concern in his eyes, it had been a cold, calculating assessment of whether she was becoming difficult. The clarity was visceral and violent. It felt like her brain was being scrubbed raw with steel wool. She realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that she wasn't just a victim of age or biology. She was a prisoner of a chemistry Barrett had spent years perfecting. He hadn't been remembering for her, he had been erasing her so there would be no one left to witness his theft. She looked back at the medical organizer, the Tuesday pill sitting there like a tiny, blue assassin. She didn't take it. Instead, she walked to the sink and swept the entire plastic tray into the basin. She watched the pills scatter, their clinical perfection mocking the ruin of her life. The morning air outside was crisp, and for the first time in years, Emily didn't feel like a ghost haunting her own body. She felt like a survivor standing on the wreckage of a burned-down house. Her mind was hers again, and though it was filled with the searing pain of Barrett's betrayal and the cold reality of her exile, it was sharp. It was functional. And as she looked at the tattered diary, she realized the fog had lifted just in time to see the cliff's edge, and the man who had been pushing her toward it. The morning light in the cabin was no longer a soft, forgiving glow. It was a cold, revealing blade that sliced through the gloom, exposing the rot in the floorboards and the deeper rot in Emily's memory. With her mind finally stripped of the chemical shroud Barrett had carefully woven around her, she sat at the scarred wooden table, the tattered diary trembling in her hands. This book was no longer just a collection of old thoughts, it was a message from a ghost, the woman she had been before the blur began. As she turned the pages, the handwriting began to change. The elegant, flowing script of her 50s, filled with notes about garden parties and Rachel's graduation, gradually devolved into a frantic, jagged scrawl. The entries from 14 months ago were short, breathless, and saturated with a growing sense of dread. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin as she read her own words, written in a moment of stolen lucidity that her current self was only just beginning to reclaim. March 12th, the entry began, the ink smeared as if the pen had been gripped with white-knuckled intensity. He watched me take them again. He doesn't look at me anymore, he looks at the pill. He calls them vitamins for the fog, but the fog only arrives after I swallow them. I tried to spit the blue one into the sink today, but he stayed. He stayed until I swallowed. My head feels like it's being filled with wet sand. If you are reading this, Emily, remember the taste. It isn't salt. It's metallic. It's a cage. Emily's breath hitched. She remembered that metallic tang now, a phantom flavor that had lingered on her tongue for 3 years. She turned the page to an entry from the following month, where the handwriting was nearly illegible, the lines sloping downward as if the writer were losing her grip on the world itself. April 19th. I found the bottle in his study. It wasn't from the pharmacy. It was a plain glass vial hidden behind the ledger of my father's trust. I managed to write down the name before I heard his shoes in the hall. Diazepam. But the dosage, it's enough to keep a horse quiet. He's not treating a sickness, he's inventing one. He's turning me into a witness who can't speak. He's moving the money, Emily. The estate, the bonds, the land, he's signing my name with a hand he's made too heavy to lift. The diary fell from her fingers, thudding onto the dusty floor. The betrayal was absolute, a calculated architectural feat of cruelty. Barrett hadn't just wanted her money, he had wanted her soul to be too quiet to protest its theft. He had used her trust as a weapon, turning her devotion into the very thing that blinded her. He had sat across from her at dinner for over 1,000 nights, smiling and nodding while he systematically erased the woman who had built his world. A horrifying realization settled over her. The cabin wasn't a random exile. She looked around the small, cramped room, seeing the built-in desk and the heavy, iron-bound chest in the corner. Her younger self, the one who had felt the sand filling her head, had chosen this place. She hadn't been sent here, she had ensured this was the only property left in her name that Barrett couldn't easily liquidate. This derelict shack was a fortress she had built for herself in the dark. It was a message sent across time, a final stand made by a woman who knew her mind was being stolen. Emily reached down and picked up the diary, clutching it to her chest as if it were the heart Barrett thought he had stopped. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the haunting, and she finally knew exactly what Barrett had been trying to hide in the fog. The weight of the diary against her chest felt like a heartbeat, a rhythmic reminder that the woman she once was had been fighting to reach her across a 3-year chasm. Emily stood in the center of the cabin, her eyes scanning the room with a new, predatory focus. If her younger self had been lucid enough to record Barrett's chemical warfare, she would have been meticulous enough to leave a trail, a map out of the labyrinth he had built for her. Her gaze settled on the heavy, mahogany desk in the corner. It was an anomaly in this rustic setting, a piece of furniture that smelled of wax and old-world authority, looking far too grand for a derelict lakeside shack. She remembered it now. It was her father's desk, the one where he had sat for 40 years managing the family's land and investments. When Barrett had moved her excess belongings into storage years ago, she must have fought to keep this one piece, insisting it be moved here. Emily approached the desk, her fingers trailing over the deep scars in the wood. She sat in the high-backed chair, feeling the familiar tilt of the seat. She began to pull at the drawers. The top ones were empty, save for a few dried-out pens and a stack of yellowing stationery. The bottom drawers were jammed, resisting her efforts with a stubborn creak of wood against wood. She tugged harder, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as the adrenaline of discovery fueled her. As the bottom right drawer finally gave way, it felt too shallow. Emily reached inside, her fingertips pressing against the back panel. She remembered her father showing her a trick when she was a girl, a hidden latch designed to protect the most sensitive ledgers of the estate. She fumbled in the shadows of the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs, until her nail caught on a small, recessed lever. With a soft, metallic click, the floor of the drawer popped upward. Beneath the false bottom lay a thick, leather-bound accordion file, its contents bulging with the weight of 42 years of history. Emily pulled it out, her hands trembling so violently she almost dropped it. She spread the papers across the desk, the dust swirling in the shafts of sunlight like tiny, silent witnesses. The documents were a masterclass in forensic accounting. Her younger self had been a ghost in her own home, secretly photocopying the very records Barrett thought he had successfully buried. There were bank statements showing the massive gift transfers from her father's trust into Barrett's private holding companies, transfers she now realized she had signed while under the heavy, syrupy influence of the blue pills. There were property deeds where her name had been systematically replaced by his, and a series of medical evaluations from Barrett's hand-picked doctor that recommended her immediate and permanent institutionalization. But at the very bottom of the file was the most devastating piece of evidence, a second will, drafted and witnessed in secret 2 years ago, when she had first suspected Barrett's intentions. It was a document that bypassed him entirely, placing the bulk of the remaining family fortune into a protected trust that only she could access, provided she could prove her own mental competency. The paper trail was a road map of her own betrayal, but it was also a weapon. Barrett had relied on her being a ghost, a woman too confused to remember her own name, let alone her own net worth. He had banked on her disappearing into the shadows of this cabin, forgotten and sedated. He didn't know that the woman he had discarded had spent her final moments of clarity building a trap. As Emily looked at the signatures and the dates, the last of the fog vanished. She wasn't just a wife who had been left behind, she was the rightful owner of an empire, and she finally had the ledger to prove it. The silence of the cabin was no longer oppressive, it was the quiet before the storm. The phone on the kitchen counter began to vibrate, its shrill, digital ring cutting through the stillness of the cabin like a jagged blade. Emily stood by the mahogany desk, her eyes fixed on the device as it skated across the wood. A few hours ago, the sound would have sent her into a spiral of panic and disorientation. Now, it was the opening bell of a performance she had been preparing for over 42 years of quiet observation. She took a slow, steadying breath, consciously relaxing the muscles in her face and allowing her shoulders to sag into the posture of a woman who had finally surrendered to the fog. When she answered, her voice was thin, a fragile reed of its former self. "Hello? Barrett? Is that you? The lights are very bright today." There was a pause on the other end, a beat of silence where she could almost hear Barrett's satisfaction. "It's me, Emily. How are you settling in? I hope you've been keeping up with the schedule. The evening dose is crucial for the restlessness." "The blue ones," Emily whispered, her eyes tracking the scattered pills she had swept into the sink earlier. "I think I took them. Or maybe I dreamed I did. Everything feels like a dream here, Barrett. The water, it won't stop talking to me. That's just the isolation, dear. It's exactly why you need to finalize the paperwork we discussed. Once the estate is consolidated under my name, I can ensure the private facility has the best staff for your unique needs." Barrett's tone was the pinnacle of practiced empathy, the same velvet-wrapped steel he had used to convince her to sign away her father's trust. "I'm sending a courier tomorrow morning with the final transfer deeds. All you have to do is sign where the tabs are. Can you do that for me, Emily? For the family? The children, will they come to see the lake?" she asked, her voice cracking with a perfectly timed tremor of hope. "Rachel promised me we'd go to the Hamptons." "Did we already go, Barrett? I can't find the photos." "The Hamptons are in the past, Emily. Focus on the papers. Just sign them, and I'll see about a visit. I'll be there myself by noon to collect them and bring you some more of your vitamins. You're doing so well, Emily. Just stay quiet. Stay still. I'll be here," she murmured, staring at the leather-bound accordion file that held his undoing. I'm not going anywhere. I don't think I can find the way back anyway. When the line went dead, the mask didn't slip immediately. Emily waited, listening to the hum of the dial tone until it faded into silence. Then, she slowly straightened her spine. The watery redness in her eyes remained, a remnant of her chemical exile, but the confusion was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. She moved to the kitchen and brewed a pot of tea, her hands steady as she cleared the desk to make room for the final documents. She wasn't just waiting for a courier, she was preparing a stage. She began to arrange the cabin to look exactly like the tomb Barrett expected it to be. She left the diary open to a page of nonsense scribbles she had practiced, and she placed the medical organizer in a prominent position, its empty slot suggesting a woman who had faithfully followed her own destruction. Barrett thought he was coming to collect the final pieces of his empire from a ghost. He had no idea that the confused old woman, on the other end of the line, had spent the last hour mapping out the legal jurisdiction of the lake property and contacting the one attorney in the city Barrett hadn't been able to buy. The trap was set, baited with the greed that had made him blind. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting the cabin into a deep, protective shadow, Emily sat in her father's chair and waited for the morning light. She had played the part of the dutiful, disappearing wife for a lifetime. She could certainly play it for one more day. The morning mist hung low over the lake, a thick, white shroud that seemed to mirror the blur Emily had inhabited for so long. But as the sound of a high-performance engine crested the gravel ridge, the fog didn't frighten her. She sat in her father's high-backed chair, her silvery gray hair deliberately mussed, her hands resting with a practiced tremor on the mahogany desk. The stage was set. When the cabin door was thrown open, the sunlight spilled in, casting Barrett's shadow long and imposing across the floorboards. He didn't knock. He entered with the entitlement of a landlord visiting a condemned property. Behind him stood Rachel and Curtis, their faces tight with a mixture of boredom and greed. They didn't look at the woman in the chair as a mother, they looked at her as the final obstacle to a clean balance sheet. "Good morning, Emily," Barrett said, his voice dripping with that clinical, hollow warmth. He didn't ask how she had slept or if she had eaten. He walked straight to the desk and slapped a leather folder down beside her. "I've brought the courier's documents. All you need to do is sign the marked sections. Then we can get you out of this drafty place and into the care you deserve." Emily blinked slowly, her watery eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. "The lake, it was so loud last night, Barrett. I forgot where the pens are. I forgot where everything is." "It's all right, Mom," Rachel interrupted, stepping forward to press a heavy gold fountain pen into Emily's hand. "Just sign. Dad will handle the rest. We just want you to be safe." Emily's fingers fumbled with the pen, letting it clatter onto the desk. As Barrett reached down to retrieve it, his face inches from hers, he didn't see the tiny, unblinking lens of the camera hidden within the shadow of the desk's ornate carving, a piece of technology Emily had purchased years ago during a single week of clarity she had never mentioned. "I'm worried, Barrett," she whispered, her voice a thin, fragile thread. "The blue pills. They taste like metal now. Like the keys to a cage. Are you sure they're helping?" Barrett stiffened, but the arrogance of his 3-year success was too great to allow for caution. He let out a sharp, impatient breath, his mask slipping just enough for the cold, resolute man beneath to show through. "The pills are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, Emily. They're keeping you quiet. They're keeping you from making a scene while I fix the mess your father left behind. Now, take the pen and sign the transfer. I'm not spending another hour in this rot." "You're making me disappear," Emily said, her voice suddenly losing its tremor, though she kept her gaze downcast. "I'm making you manageable," Barrett snapped, leaning in closer, his voice a low, jagged hiss. You were always too sharp, Emily. Always watching the ledgers, always questioning the acquisitions. The diagnosis was the best thing that ever happened to this family. A few milligrams of diazepam a day, and suddenly the North Star of the family was just a ghost in a hospital gown. It was so easy, I almost felt sorry for you. Almost. Now sign the damn paper. The silence that followed was absolute. Rachel and Curtis shifted uncomfortably, but neither spoke. They were complicit in the silence, their eyes fixed on the inheritance the signature would unlock. Then, Emily did something that stopped the air in Barrett's lungs. She sat up straight. She reached out, not with a tentative, questioning gesture, but with a firm, steady hand, and picked up the gold pen. She didn't sign the paper. Instead, she reached under the desk and pressed a button on a small, black remote. Barrett's own voice suddenly filled the room, sharp, clear, and damning, replaying the words he had just uttered. The pills are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. I'm making you manageable. Barrett lunged for the desk, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage, but Emily was already standing. She moved with a grace and speed that shouldn't have been possible for a woman they believed was half erased. She stepped back, holding the accordion file from the false bottom like a shield. I wasn't the only one watching the ledgers, Barrett, she said, her voice now ringing with the authority of the woman who had built his empire. And I wasn't the only one who knew about the diazepam. You didn't leave me with nothing. You left me with my father's desk, my father's secrets, and a clarity you couldn't poison. You're hallucinating, Curtis stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Mom, you're sick. This isn't real. What's real, Curtis, is that the recording you just heard has already been uploaded to a secure server held by my attorneys, Emily said, her watery eyes now sharp and terrifyingly lucid. What's real is that the worthless cabin is currently surrounded by 2 private investigators and a medical board representative I contacted yesterday morning. You didn't leave a ghost in this cabin, Barrett. You left a witness. Barrett looked at the woman he had discarded, and for the first time in 42 years, he felt the cold, paralyzing grip of a power he couldn't manipulate. The unmasking was complete. The man who had tried to steal her memory had just provided the one piece of evidence that would ensure he was the one forgotten. Emily stood her ground, the tattered diary in her hand, as the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the morning mist. The blur was over, the reckoning had begun. 6 months later, the morning mist still rolled over the lake, but it no longer felt like a shroud. To Emily, the gray vapor now resembled a blank canvas, a quiet space where new memories could be painted without the fear of being erased. She sat on the restored porch of the cabin, the wood now sturdy and stained a warm honey gold, a mug of tea steaming in her hands. The forgotten cabin had been renamed the Sentinel, and it was no longer a place of exile, but the headquarters of a revolution. The legal battle had been swift and devastating, a surgical dismantling of Barrett's carefully constructed empire. The recording from the cabin, combined with the forensic trail of the hidden ledgers and the testimony of a doctor who had finally traded his silence for immunity, had stripped Barrett of everything. He had traded a hospital room for a jail cell, his reputation incinerated by the very medical pragmatism he had used as a weapon. Rachel and Curtis, facing the loss of their trust funds and the public shame of their complicity, had attempted to retreat into the shadows, but Emily had ensured that their inheritance was redirected to the people they had overlooked for 42 years. But Emily didn't find her peace in the courtroom. She found it in the faces of the women who now walked the garden paths around the lake. She had used her reclaimed fortune to found the Morrison Center for Elder Justice, a high-tech advocacy and refuge center specifically designed to protect those facing the silent, invisible warfare of domestic and financial abuse. The cabin served as the heart of the campus, a reminder that a mind, even one under siege, is a fortress that can be reclaimed. The center was more than a legal clinic, it was a sanctuary of memory. Emily had stocked the library with journals and records, and she employed a team of specialists who focused on cognitive restoration and legal autonomy. She spent her afternoons not as a patient, but as a mentor, sitting with men and women who had been told their voices no longer mattered because their hair had turned silver. She showed them her tattered diary, the Book of the Ghost, as proof that the truth remains even when the world tries to drown it in a blur. As the sun began to climb over the pines, painting the autumn leaves in shades of amber and gold, Emily felt a profound sense of integration. The 42 years of her marriage were no longer a wasted lifetime, they were the training ground that had made her a guardian. Her memory was sharp, not because the illness had never existed, but because she had learned to curate what stayed. She remembered the betrayal, yes, but she also remembered the strength it took to survive it. Her power had never truly left her, it had simply been waiting for the fog to lift so it could see the work that needed to be done. As she watched a new resident arrive at the gate, a woman with a single suitcase and a look of profound disbelief, Emily stood up and walked down the porch steps. She didn't offer a tentative gesture this time. She reached out with a hand that was steady, certain, and strong. "Welcome to the Sentinel," Emily said, her voice clear and resonant in the crisp morning air. "You aren't forgotten here. And you are finally safe to remember who you are." As they walked toward the house together, the ripples on the lake smoothed into a perfect, glassy reflection of the sky. The legacy of the mind was no longer about holding on to the past, but about building a future where no one would ever be erased again. Emily Ann Morrison was no longer a wife, a victim, or a ghost. She was the architect of her own life, and for the first time in nearly half a century, she knew exactly where she was going.